Today we have Gabrielle Lyon, PhD. Gabrielle directs the education efforts of the Chicago Architecture Foundation, recently renamed the Chicago Architecture Center. There have been 2 grants provided by Land Economics Foundation for this very, very exciting project. This project is called Meet Your City, and it's an education effort that Gabrielle and her staff are undertaking to reach 30,000 8th and 9th graders in the Chicago public school system and educate them about the importance of public planning. And this is modeled roughly on the historic Wacker Manual that was created after the Burnham Plan of 1909 and the 1911. From then on, it was used for several years in the Chicago school system. We're trying to do a contemporary update of this. And the funding from LEF did a couple things. It certainly put our imprimatur on it. We were delighted to be associated with a project like this. But secondly, it also enabled an initial printing and a second grant, and helped facilitate some teacher training, also using the Planning Chicago book that LEF helped underwrite. Just a couple highlights from Gabrielle's life. She has spent 20 years in a project called Project Exploration, which is how to convert the findings of modern science into messages that underserved minority boys and girls can understand. And now she's tackled this kind of mission for the Chicago Architecture Center. She, along the way, got a BA and an MA from the University of Chicago in history, a PhD from UIC in curriculum and in instruction, and she has a very special treat for us today. The book we're talking about having been printed is what, in my generation, would call a comic book. It's a graphic novel, and it's a graphic novel, and she has 30 copies for you to take back to your cities and your chapters and say, maybe this could be a good model to implement in our public school system or in our community college or wherever, to get students engaged in the story of modern city planning. So she has 30 copies on the back table signed. Self-select yourself. We're going to trust you not to put 4 of them in your purse or something. But certainly each chapter president should take one of these back. And in the meantime, Gabrielle's been busy posting all kinds of teacher resource materials on their website that she's going to tell you about. And you'll be able to access all of them, essays, videos, and so on and so forth, and start applying them in some of your own cities. Gabrielle, I don't want to steal too much more of your thunder. Please come up here.
On behalf of the Chicago Architecture Center, I really do want to thank every one of you for the support, which now is in its 2nd year. The first year, we got the encouragement to think about the foundation as a support site, and that money came in at a time, and I was saying this a little bit earlier this morning, the money came in at a time when people were like, what is this project you're trying to do? We don't understand it. It seems crazy. Is it going to work? And when the money came in, it did a couple of things. It signaled, frankly, to our board that this was a viable project, not just something that was a light comic book, but really viable to be part of a very serious conversation about what is the role of urban planning now and what is the role of urban planning in terms of fostering civic engagement. So I thank you for that. And then we put those dollars to work to get the first printing made. What I'd like to do today in the 15 minutes or so is just take you through a little bit of the background of the project. And I think the best way to start is actually by showing you a video from Kickstarter. I worked very closely with a group of artists to develop the graphic novel that you're seeing right now. So we had the concept, we had some seed money, but we didn't have enough to take it across the finish line if we were going to print enough to get some traction on this goal of reaching 30,000 young people. And so we developed a crowdsource campaign on Kickstarter. No Small Plans is a brand new graphic novel. It follows the adventures of young people in Chicago in the past, present, and future, and they're all wrestling with questions about why design matters, how they can be engaged stewards for their neighborhoods and their city.
I'm excited about No Small Plans because I think it's going to have a real impact on Chicago, and it will give our teens a way to look at design and how it will impact our city for years to come. This is a great legacy project for not only the Chicago Architecture Foundation, but for the students of the city.
Not everyone has the same access to civic engagement. Young people of color, students who maybe are coming from families who are poor or in under-resourced schools, they are not getting access to civics education. In the long run, that means they're less likely to vote, they're less likely to serve as volunteers or on boards or committee, but most importantly, it means that their voices aren't really going to be heard. Students have been with us every step of the way, and they're the ones who are like sending me emails, when is No Small Plans gonna be ready? When do I get my copy?
I love that my neighborhood, Bronzeville, is actually in the book.
I love about the book that it's time travel almost. It gives teenagers and anyone who reads the book the ability to go back into the past.
In chapter 2, there's a young woman named Natalie who's being displaced, and she's on the 606 bridge just as I am now. She is going to be displaced due to gentrification, but this is truly happening to people in Chicago, and that's just the great part about what No Small Plans shows. It shows people that aren't used to being exposed to this information that this is truly happening out there.
I love the character Kodak. She's amazing. Like, just to be in a city like Chicago that's so industrial and everything is tall and everything is made of glass, she's found herself in nature. Pretty cool, if you ask me.
We have a big vision. We want to give away the novel for free. It costs $10 to get the novel into a young person's hand.
If we get a lot of more support behind the book, then I just feel like it'll just be like really big. Like the book could just explode.
Help the Chicago Architecture Foundation get these books in the hands of the young kids of our world. Is that okay? Of our world, or is that too global?
So the great news is that video worked along with write-ups by many people in the urban planning community. We got a lot of traction, and in fact, over the 30-day campaign, we were able to raise nearly $60,000. But the point I think that John DeVries made earlier, the reason why it's been interesting for people, and not just people in Chicago, we had backers from 12 countries show up, is because there's a really critical need to bring to life this role of planning in a way that's really transparent. Sometimes success can be a burden, like when the truck showed up with the copies that we printed and we realized the Chicago Architecture Foundation didn't have a forklift to take them off the back of the car. We also had to do all kinds of logistics to actually support backers and get them their kits and their packages. I know a lot about how many boxes fit in my Prius. But the most important thing is this book was made, and it was made through the help of many, many people who basically gave us $25. And it is right now in, for example, every single Chicago public library. As you're passing this book around, a couple of highlights about these stories. Chapter 1 is set in 1928. It was a particular, very intentional moment that we chose. So certainly after the 1909 plan, during the surge of development, but also before the Depression. So it's really at the peak of development. Every frame is based on a real place. So in the lower right-hand corner, you can see Ida B. Wells's house, which still exists in Bronzeville, as well as a house that in 1928, had you walked past it, it would have been burned down. You would have seen the ruins because it had actually been brought down during one of the race riots. So part of what we've done is annotate every single page, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But chapter 1 really addresses the big questions for young people as they merge downtown. Who is the city for? In the midst of growth and development and engineering marvels like bridges that lift and the new invention of skyscrapers, who really is the city for, and how is the city going to be designed to bridge some of the divides? Chapter 2 is set, it was set in the present at the time, but now it's the past, 2017. It opens up with maybe a typical planning exercise. Young people in a high school class, maybe a typical 9th grade human geography class, are working on a zoning exercise. And so they're highlighting, they're looking at all these different issues. And the story opens up immediately with this tension. Natalie has just found out that her family, which has been living in Humboldt Park, Logan Square area for generations, is being put out of their home. And her new friend says, "Hey, where do you live?" And she points, and he says, "Oh, I live right by you. I love this neighborhood. We've just moved in." And so immediately you feel this tension. And as we get to know the characters in chapter 2, David, who lives in Englewood, Natalie, who is not politically aware very much. She really is just thinking about herself at the beginning of the book. By the end, thanks to help from her friend Christina and her new friend Jessie, really begins to understand that what's happening to her as an individual is part of a collective experience. At the end of the chapter, you see David back in his neighborhood, Englewood, and the last frame is him walking into the door of his alderman's office. We don't know what he's going to say. We don't know what he's going to ask for or try to get involved with. And that's part of the intent of this book. It's really a curriculum of observation, of questions, and hopefully a jumping off point for people who read the book to talk about what do we think he did? What do we think he said? What is it he's noticing and seeing? Chapter 3 is set in the future, 2211, exactly 200 years to the day from when the original Wacker's Manual was published. The original Wacker's Manual really lasted for nearly 3 decades, and when you read chapter 3, part of what we've done very slyly, I think, is excerpted language from the introduction of 1911 and just plugged it into 2211. It holds up. But the real issue for us in 2211 is we posit the possibility that young people are put in charge of making decisions. And so what happens when Sang, Octavius, Codex, what happens when they have a mandatory year of civic service? What happens when they're put on the planning committee? And then they have to make a decision about what's going to be built in a neighborhood that none of them live in. Feel familiar? The other issue is that even though it's the future, it's very much familiar. There's still segregation. There's still a concentration of resources downtown. And so how do these young people navigate that? So the more things change, the more they stay the same. And if you recall the video we saw just a second ago, you hear a story about nature. It was really important to us that this idea that nature still exists in the future, which we think it will and we think it should. But there were a lot of choices like that that went into deciding what's going to be in these books. And most of all, what is it we're talking about right now? There's actually a beautifully written plan for the Southeast side that talks about preservation. So many of the things you read are based on real life issues, real life conversations. This chapter ends again, they make a choice about what development project to choose. You don't know. We end every chapter with a map. These are real places you can go to. And that really brings me to the second part of what this is about. We hope this is a great book and that you love reading it. And that should be good enough for young people to see themselves reflected, having agency, being involved in why design matters. But as the Chicago Architecture Center, we have a real commitment to reaching tens of thousands of young people and trying to achieve a critical mass. And we're doing that through copies of the book, which we're able to distribute thanks to grants and when people buy the book, partnerships, and the kinds of trainings and workshops that the most recent LEF grant supported. There's an online toolkit that is free for download. It includes some framing essays, including one by John about what is planning. Urban planning is not a normal conversation in most schools these days, and in fact, the kinds of classes that traditionally would have incorporated urban planning concepts have gotten fewer and fewer, especially over the last 2.5 decades. So in the 50s, you might have been exposed during a civics class or a government's class to the role of planning. Those have really been truncated or evaporated, and if they're available, they're often available quite late in a high school student's careers. We have chapter guides, discussion questions, extensive resources and activities to help those teachers take action who want to. And that brings me to the most important part. Teachers want this book. They want to have these conversations. This picture is the same city. These photographs were taken 5 miles apart, but to be able to understand how you end up with this kind of difference in the same city is not easy. It's a complicated story. There are a lot of levers. It's not transparent. And so one of the things that we know No Small Plans can do is spark dialogue. It raises questions like, who is the city for? How do neighborhoods change? And we know they change. A young person grows up and thinks, this is the neighborhood. It's always been like this. But anyone that's lived in the same place for a while knows that places change. When we work with young people ourselves, using No Small Plans in the Meet Your City initiative, we're very much focused on the conversation about what makes a good neighborhood and really raising questions for young people. What is my role and what is my responsibility? We published this book a little over a year ago, and we've been putting it to work. As I mentioned before, it's in every single Chicago public library. The library's really been a wonderful partner, but so have teachers, individual teachers and their principals. This is a map, the most current snapshot of the distribution. It's almost in every single neighborhood. We're doing some analysis now. So orange is elementary schools and blue are high schools. But the other picture I want you to see is this one. These are libraries and community organizations that are actively using No Small Plans in their conversations with young people. And sometimes it's adults. The Obama Foundation asked us to come and run a workshop where we use No Small Plans as a jumping off point for community engagement. But also places like the Pilsen Alliance, Logan Square Neighborhood Association, really deeply embedded small community organizations that are wrestling with these issues up front. We ask kids to design a neighborhood, and we've done it now with thousands of kids, and we take notes during their planning process about what they think is most important to have in a neighborhood. And what our kids in Chicago are saying are these things. This is a word cloud showing the things they think are most important. But for those of you that maybe don't live in Chicago, don't work with students that are in under-resourced neighborhoods, I want to make sure that you're understanding that reason the gas station, for example, is so big is not because they all think everybody's going to have cars. It's because that's where they're buying groceries. That's where they're buying light bulbs and batteries. When you see things like parks, churches, fire station, you see nail salon, barbershop. Those are the small businesses that they're most familiar with. Not all students everywhere, but in the young people that we've been working with. And in my last couple of minutes, I want to highlight some of the projects that this book has catalyzed. In Englewood, a library group that works with teens developed this fabulous 5-minute documentary about seeing Englewood. They basically did a Design Your Neighborhood workshop and said, there are things about Englewood that we see that other people don't see. Let's put that in a film. It will be the best 5 minutes you have ever spent. It gives you a completely different perspective on a neighborhood that often is associated only with violence. And it's a very authentic way of thinking about the built environment when you see what they've chosen to highlight about what matters to them. On the far southeast side of Chicago, there's a bursting at the seams elementary school called George Washington. The librarian there developed a project for every single sixth grader, 90 sixth graders. And because you're planners, I'm showing you a couple of documents that I think will be important. The red in the bottom corner of the map is the 10th ward. There are 50 wards in Chicago. The 10th ward is the largest. I lived there for about 12 years. It's also the site of the old USX steel site. It's the largest piece of undeveloped property in the city. That's the site that they've chosen to develop plans for. That's the site they presented to their alderwoman, and that's the site that hopefully they'll have some say over what happens to. We haven't done a huge amount of valuation. We just haven't really had the resources. But at the end of every one of our workshops, we do a very quick reflection where we ask young people to respond to the prompt, I used to think, but now I think. Just a random sample. I used to think Chicago was plain and boring with some malls and good food. Now I think it has good food and art structures and a good and bad history. I used to think there was a separation of neighborhoods. Now I think we're all connected. I used to think Chicago was nothing but killing. Now I think it's a nice place to explore. These are the documents we're familiar with in our lives. The plan of Chicago, and maybe, we dust off our whackers as our whackers manual. But there's a moment to be relevant, and there's a moment to enter the conversation. No Small Plans has been one way to have that conversation, but the most important thing is to put that conversation on the front burner. There is no better opportunity than joining urban planning with young people. There's just not. It's real work, it's meaningful work, it develops the skills they need. The Chicago Architecture Center, we hope you come and join us if you don't already know us. We have a big portfolio for education. We do a lot of work with professional development, and now we have some really extraordinary exhibits. If you've seen us before but haven't seen us recently, we opened a new center on August 31st, and Blair Kamen, our architecture critic, called it the center's newest architectural gem. It's also the home for No Small Plans and Meet Your City. And so come see us and visit us, and thank you so very much for your support.
I'm Dina Grinnell from Vancouver. Wonderful to see our support going to an initiative like yours. So now that you've made it this far, what are your next steps in the near term or longer for this?
So the next steps for us are, one, really trying to meet the demand. So we have 160 teachers on a waiting list who want to go through the training and want copies of the book. So it's successful, but meanwhile, we're really trying to continue to raise money. So we're just working on honoring our commitment, supporting teachers, and I think the biggest opportunity and challenge for us ahead is highlighting what teachers are doing with the book. We are in nearly 100 schools. Every one of those schools has really interesting projects going on.
I see you brought 30 copies here, but if folks were interested in getting more, how would they reach out?
The best way to buy a copy, if that's what you're interested in, and every time we sell a copy, we give one away for free, is right through the Chicago Architecture Center's website. We have been selling copies to community colleges, to universities in Florida and Colorado. So that's been a great way to try to sustain the project. But honestly, every time you buy one or recommend it to someone, it really helps the project. And you can just go to the architecture.org website and buy it right online.